What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. The time is about 3:44 p.m., June 27th. Yeah, and we are back at it now for another live stream today, and we are doing the second book in my book react series. Go check out the video I did covering Jesse Daniels' Cyber Racism, the 2009 book talking about white supremacy online and the proliferation of those ideas. Today, we are doing a book that has been on the agenda for a long time, and there's some story for this book. So I'm going to briefly do a story before I get into it. So I moved to Turkey around 2021, 2022, something like that, right? 2022. Yeah, I moved to Turkey in 2022 to be with my girlfriend, who is now my wife, Akdeniz. I moved to Istanbul, and I'll be honest, I had no idea that I would ever visit Turkey, because Turkey wasn't like one of those places I really wanted to go to when I was younger. Even when I became Muslim, like, Turkey was not the ideal place or the place that I planned, on my bucket list or anything like that, right? So I ended up living in Istanbul, right? That's how life works, for about a year and some change. And then off and on over the past few years, I've been going back and forth to Turkey. So like 3 months in Turkey here, 1 month there, stuff like that. So overall, my time in Turkey has been close to like 2 years. 2 years of my life have been spent living amongst the Turks, right? And also my wife being Turkish as well. I got introduced to their culture, their language, their food, their history as well, and learned quite a lot. And I have a lot of respect, actually, for Turkish culture, their people, and I have a lot of sympathy for what they're going through right now as a people living on the periphery of Europe that the Europeans tend to treat like second-class Europeans, right? So there's a lot to talk about with Turkey, but my blackness comes first. And I realized very quickly, being in Turkey, that anti-blackness is very prevalent in their society. They call us Zenchis. They have a history of slavery that even rivals, or I would argue surpasses, the history of slavery against black people in America or in the Americas, right? Like, in Turkey, they have been very brutal to black people throughout their history, and this is documented. And I even read a book while living in Istanbul the first time I was there, that I checked out from the library of the university that my wife was going to, that talked about the history of slavery in Turkey, and how many black people were imported into that country just over 1 century. And it's an astounding number. The number that I talked about in the video I did talking about being black in Turkey was about 500,000 people. 500,000 people, 500,000 black men and women were imported into Turkey, right? And the only reason you don't have a large population or minority of black people in Turkey today is because mass castration was done on the slaves. It was not allowed for the slaves to reproduce. So what the Arabs and Turks did is that they would capture these black men in Africa, cut off their penises, and then put them to work, right, for the rest of their lives, right? There is a small minority, a small population of Turkish people who have African ancestry, who are not recent immigrants, and they live in one of the cities towards like the center south of the country. I forgot the name, but you can look it up. There are Afro-Turks who are descended of those slaves, but they comprise like a infinitesimal number of the Turkish population, right? So while I was like living in Turkey, I was, of course, studying anti-blackness, and because that is an issue that is very close to my heart, and the fight against white supremacy. And I was reading books and stuff like that, and I was looking up research papers on blackness in Turkey. Like, what have the Turkish academics thought about white supremacy, about blackness, about the race of the Turks, and everything like that. And then I ended up coming across this book, Is the Turk a White Man, by Murat Ergin, right? And I believe also, I didn't check, but I believe Murat Ergin was also the author of the book that I read about slavery in Turkey as well. So this might be my second time reading his book, but I have to go back and check. Either way, I found out about this book, but I didn't I'll be honest with you, I didn't want to buy it online, because academic books like this are like $50, $40. And when we look at the price of this book here on Amazon, it's about $30. Okay. It's not undoable, and right. And everybody should buy the book. And I'm encouraging people to buy the book here. But back then I didn't want to buy it. So I ended up finding the email to this author, Murat Ergin, right? And I said, hey, my name is Simon. I'm a black American living in Istanbul, and I really want to read your book. but I kind of don't have the money for it. I'm just an English teacher. I don't make that much money. Can you help a brother out, right? I didn't expect to hear back from him. I didn't expect to, get any sort of correspondence. But Murat actually emailed me back the book in the PDF, and I was kind of shocked. I replied like, "Thank you," and I was very happy that he actually sent me this book personally. So Murat, if you're watching this, I want to tell you again, thank you for sending me this book, and yeah, for anybody who's interested in getting this book, I encourage you to buy it. But if you are a person who wants to learn and you enjoy reading, I got the hookup on free books. So holla at me. That's not a scam. I'm not trying to peddle you anything. No membership, no money, no nothing. I'll send you the link. Just hit me up on Twitter, Laji M. Riki, and we can do some business, right? It's not hard to find my Twitter. It's all over my YouTube page. But Murat sent me the book himself. So I thought that was a sign from God that I do need to read this book. But you know how people are with books. Every day you say, "Oh, I'm going to read today," and then you put it off till tomorrow. Then tomorrow comes and you pick up something else to do and you don't end up actually reading. Nobody has the time to read, and that's a big problem in our society. We need to find time to actually read. So I'm going to run through Murat, who he is as a person, because it's important to know who these writers are and why we're talking and why we will be reading this book. And today I will be reading the introduction and chapter 1 of Is the Turk a White Man? Race and Modernity in Making of Turkish Identity, Studies in Critical Social Sciences, published in 2018. The paperback version is available on Amazon for $30, as you see. And yeah, let's go through who Murat Ergin is. So this is the guy that you see right here. He's also in the thumbnail of this video. He is a professor at Koç University in sociology and a faculty member. He has plenty of his papers published online that are not hard to find. I believe he's written quite a few books, and some of them have interesting titles, and they are definitely things that I will be interested in reading, right? But when I click download here, it's like, yo, you have to join a membership, and this is the problem with academia, right? Like, to get knowledge nowadays is so expensive, and that's a problem. It shouldn't be so damn expensive, all right? Uh, Brian G says, you're muted. I don't know how I got muted. Let me check. No, I'm not muted, Brian G. I'm not muted. Yeah, you can hear me well. You can hear me well. Anyway, continuing here. So let's run through Murat's actual CV right here. So here's Murat Ergin. Here's his information, but I'm not going to have that on screen long. So his education, right? Uh, his education. He got his PhD in sociology at the University of Minnesota, Minneapolis in 2005. In 2000, he got a Master of Arts in Sociology, University of Minnesota, Minneapolis. In 1996, he got a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology, Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, Turkey, and he has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and International Relations from Boğaziçi University, Istanbul. I admire his academic career. This is exactly the type of path I want to go on. I eventually want to earn my PhD in sociology, which is why I'm out here in Budapest right now to actually go and study. So let's go through his employment history, because we should always look up the background of the people that you are reading books on or reading books from. So employment and teaching experience, 2005 to the present. He works at the Department of Sociology at Koç University in Istanbul, Turkey. He is the associate professor from 2012 to the present, assistant professor from 2005 to 2012. The courses he taught: undergraduate introduction to sociology, Turkish society and comparative perspective, sociology of crime and deviance, sociology of everyday life, nationalism, modernity and culture, encounters with the West, sociology of music. And in graduate courses, he taught contemporary social theory, crime and deviance, science, technology and society, nations and nationalism. Excellent, excellent. I would love to be a student in one of his courses. In the spring 2005, he was the instructor at the Department of Sociology at the University of Buffalo in America. The course he taught was Sociology of Deviance. In 1998 to 2003, he was the instructor at the Department of Sociology, University of Minnesota. The courses he taught were American Race Relations, basic social statistics, social research methods, introduction to sociology, computer usage for social statistics. In 1997 to 2001, he was the teaching assistant at the University of Minnesota. The courses assisted. He taught the Department of Sociology, research methods, introduction to sociology, American corrections, descriptive statistics, principles of social psychology, social organizations, Department of History, history of the Ottoman Empire, Middle East survey, Arab Islam in the Caliphal age. Turkish, and his publications are many. And the one we are reading today, his latest book, at least as far as his CV shows, is The Turk, a White Man, published in 2016. But the rest of his articles and books are here. He is very prolific. I'm not going to run through all of his books, but yeah, he's won quite a lot of honors as well. This is a very meticulous CV, and he seems to be a very well-educated man and very accomplished academic. So shout out to Murat Ergin once again. Shout out to you, Murat, for sending me this book. Shout out to you for giving me the green light to go ahead and read your material. And I encourage everybody to support the academics, the writers, the publishers, people that are actually trying to educate people, which is what we will do today. So let's jump into it. Is the Turk a White Man? Race and Modernity in the Making of Turkish Identity by Murat Ergin. All right, published by Brill, Leiden in Boston. I don't know. We're not going to be reading the acknowledgments. Like I said, we're only jumping into the introduction and chapter 1 today. It's about 33 pages or so. So y'all bear with me and let's go. So, in 1909, the United States Circuit Court in Cincinnati set out to decide whether a Turkish citizen shall be neutralized as a white person. The New York Times article, which discussed the question of Turks' whiteness and compared it to the exclusion of Chinese, Japanese, Burmese, and their half-breeds from U.S. citizenship, was cheekily entitled, "Is the Turk a White Man?" in 1909. A few decades later, having understood the vitality of this question for their modernization efforts, Turkish elites had already started a full-fledged scientific mobilization to respond to this question with a resounding yes, and to make sure everyone in the world heard it. The extremely colorful rhetoric of this fantastic scientific search placed Turkey in world history as the cradle of Western civilization, and Turks as the creators of human language and the forgotten source of white racial stock. From the Hittites to the Mayans and from the Chinese to the Greeks, the discovery of the world's Turkish origins knew no boundaries. So, if you don't know why I'm so interested in this topic, like I said, my wife is Turkish, and when you're around Turkish people, they have this joke, this meme that they like to say. They like to say everybody is Turkish, right? Like they'll find some aspect of a person or a culture or a nation and then say, yep, they're just like Turkish people, they're Turkish people too, right? Something like that, right? Or that but I think also that meme or that joke goes a bit deeper, because I do think that a lot of Turkish people get inculcated with this idea that they come from an exceptional society or an exceptional stock of people because of the history of them conquering Anatolia, coming from the East, them being a conglomeration of Middle Easterners and Europeans and being at the crossroads of the world between Europe and Asia. So I do think there is that sort of Turkish exceptionalism that lives within them as well. But there is also, because of the modern creation of race, there is somewhat of an inferiority complex, because whiteness and race are tied a lot to, certain phenotypes, but also towards certain identity markers, right? Like being Christian, like, speaking certain languages that derive from Europe, right? And the Turks speak a language that derives from Central Asia and stuff like that. And the Turks are Muslim as well, so that puts them at odds with the Christian world. And because of the Ottoman Empire as well, their conquest across Europe as well, it seems like there's always this sort of back and forth with their identity. Of course, many of them look white. Like you'll find Turks with green eyes, blue eyes, red hair, blonde hair, and that sort of stuff. But there are also marks on the box that they don't check, right, when it comes to classifying themselves as white. And so my reason for endeavoring into reading this book and delving into this topic is because I really want to try to understand, because I've been very vocal about my experiences with anti-Black racism in Turkey and rationalizing, where Turks sit in the fight against white supremacy and why they are so obsessed with them being blonde when they were younger. Anyway, continuing here. While North American and European scholars relied on strictly formulated taxonomies comparing and contrasting East and West, the classified objects in the East were not passive. From Iran and Japan to Latin America, local scholars adopted, reformulated, and indigenized the racial, historical, and cultural taxonomies emanating from a Western modernity for which they yearned. The Turkish experience with race and its affiliated cultural universe is not simply an example of the negotiations between universally intended racial discourses and locally produced responses. The invention of racial categories in Turkey, in many ways, challenges the distinctions between the universal and the local. In a truly multifaceted process, racial discourses in Turkey emerged in close encounters with European and North American scholars who worked as academics and experts, published and gave speeches, and participated in conferences in Turkey. In addition, the Turkish rewriting of history became a model for countries like Iran. This unknown chapter in history places Turkey within the context of transnational racial discourses and challenges conventional histories on Turkey precisely because of its emphasis on race and nation construction within a wave of transnational movement of ideas and individuals. Finally, the efforts to establish the whiteness of Turks in the formative 1930s left a deep mark in Turkish identity, shaping Turkey's confrontation with modernity and surfacing in a number of contemporary debates that range from Turkey's EU application to the Kurdish question. The idea for this book was planted in my mind in Minneapolis, where I studied as a graduate student. One afternoon in 1999, I was having lunch in a cheap diner with a group of graduate students from Turkey. The topic of conversation somehow drifted toward African Americans and their experiences. When an engineering student in the group began to utter racial stereotypes, I felt that I needed to intervene as a social scientist. The best strategy I could come up with at that moment was to caution him about the fact that many Americans would consider him an alien, a stranger, and possibly, quote unquote, black. However, the strategy to build a coalition of the weak through commonalities of experience collapsed quickly when my friend confidently remarked, "But I am white. How could anyone confuse me with blacks?" There was more than skin color to whiteness, I noticed, because by standards of skin color only, one could easily classify him to have a darker skin color than many around us. The racial position so effortlessly carved out was based on historically nourished discourse around Turkish identity, modernity, and cultural superiority. See, I know my audience has been waiting for me to be anti-immigrant. I know my audience has been waiting for me to be the guy who's like, kick all the immigrants out. Listen, I'm only going to be anti-immigrant when these guys start coming in with these anti-black thoughts, perspectives, and views. And listen, if the Turks are coming in saying I'm better than the blacks, I'm white, and blacks are like this, and they're talking about stereotypes, yeah, we need to kick the immigrants out. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people. In fact, I would say the vast majority of people who come into America from other countries are anti-black implicitly or outright anti-black racists, right? So I'm glad that Murat was a good ally at that time, trying to check his friend for being racist against black people, a group of people who did nothing to him, a group of people who have done nothing to the Turkish people, right? I'm glad he did that. But on the other hand, we need to start screening these people that are coming into America. Seriously. Right? It's not because they're committing violence, they're coming here as rapists, murderers, and thugs. No, it's because they're coming in as racists. That's why they need to be blocked from getting their visas. Anyway, continuing here. Looking back, I can make a number of observations about this encounter. The first one has to do with how discourses flow across settings and are manifested in the details of everyday life. Here was a person who grew up in Turkey and built a selfhood around whiteness through large-scale racial discourses shaped by socialization, education, and the media. However, in this particular setting, he becomes an agent enacting these discourses, shaping and reinforcing them at the same time. Second, his racial sense of self would most likely sorry his racial sense of self would be most likely dormant and muted in certain moments, especially in his home country. Ethnicity as a way of classifying people is not an alien concept in the Turkish context. Race makes much rarer appearances. However, silent and taken for granted racial assumptions erupt in a moment of confrontation with quote unquote others across the world. This is how muted yet powerful discourses become embodied in everyday encounters. Third, this identification with whiteness emerged as a result of flows of ideas and peoples across borders. Throughout the transformations that modernized Turkey and the Ottoman Empire in the last 2 centuries, racial theories and vocabularies originating in European and North American contexts transplanted themselves into the local context and mutated in different ways. In an endless spiral of perceptions of the West and the perceptions of Western perceptions of Turkey, race played a significant role in the formulations of an authentic modernity and the formation of Turkish identity. I just want to, give my interpretation of this paragraph because I think it's important. in Turkey, and especially if you've been to Turkey or talked to Turkish people, and if you're black or a person interested in studying blackness, race, white supremacy, that sort of stuff, Turkish people give that automatic response that most white people give. They say, you know, there is no racism in Turkey, and we don't see color, brother. We do not see color in Turkey, right? But this is the thing. Turkey, like most other parts of the world, have imported a lot of Western culture. If you're a person watching Netflix, you're going to pick up our cultural stuff related to race and blackness and whiteness and who is black and who is white, because those things are a part of our media. If not in Netflix, in our books, in our comic books, in our magazines and stuff like that, you will pick up on that stuff. So a lot of the world has taken America's culture and interpreted and flipped it in a lot of other ways. On top of that, Turkey is exceptional to a lot of other countries that give that defense that there is no race in Turkey, or they do not see racism, because Turks have a very storied history with black people. It's not like you're talking to a person from Finland where there was no, black chattel slavery, but Turkey, they did have that. So Turks who put up that defense where they say there was never a time when black people were considered lesser than in Turkey, that's historically false, right? It's historically false, and I've covered that in previous videos, right? And I hopefully that will be talked about in this book as well, right? So that's my interpretation of this text that he's saying here. In a lot of ways, though, Turkish people like to say we don't care about race, but if they're honest, they'll say, well, in Turkey there's a problem with the Arabs, or there's a problem with the Kurds, right? So ethnicity is a touchstone, or a touching point in Turkey that can cause a lot of flares. You might hear somebody say something racist about Kurds or Arabs, right? But what he is saying there, when he says confrontations with others across the world, if you're black in Turkey and get into an argument with a Turkish person, it's very likely that person would then start insulting you racially. Right? So all this stuff about we don't see race, or this doesn't even cross our mind, it's very likely that somebody would insult you racially because they are aware of those differences. You get what I'm saying? So continuing here in the book, this person embodying the discourses that emerged as a result of 2 centuries long global flows and employing them in an everyday encounter with racial differences tells much about the subject matter of this book. First, contemporary racial discourses operate silently. One aspect of this has to do with the way whiteness emerges as the taken for granted category, whereas non-white races are marked, studied, and generalized. This explains why, upon hearing that I study race in Turkey, many assumed that I was working on Kurds. Ha! The other aspect has to do with the perception that race is a foreign concept with no applicability in the Turkish context. The first chapter deals with various accounts I encountered during the research phase of this book and explains how these accounts deny the very existence or relevance of race. In the Turkish context, the related concepts of nation and ethnicity dominate the debates. Without underestimating variations across cases, insights from critical race theory offer significant tools to understand the formation and maintenance of Turkish identity. Water break. All right. Second, racial discourses flow across settings and societies. I pay particular attention to the links between race and modernity in order to emphasize how the flows of ideas and people between the West and Turkey contributed to the formation of identities. These flows of racial images were not carried only through the movements of ideas and theoretical positions across borders. Individuals who moved through national boundaries during the turbulent times of World War II contributed to the fermentation and legitimization of racialized thinking. Emigre scholars who were employed in Turkey under various capacities were not only expected to participate in the racial mobilization of this period, but were also seen as the epitome of Western knowledge and scholarship, there to observe and approve of Turkey's progress. Also, transborder flows of ideas and people were not unidirectional. While the West stood as an important source of scientific theories of race, perceptions of the East, as exemplified in this book with the stereotype, the quote unquote terrible Turk, shaped Western race science. Thus, while race science in the 19th and early 20th centuries was classifying the world into groups of inferior and superior races in line with existing stereotypes, Elites in Turkey were acutely aware of their place in Western racial cosmologies and actively seeking ways to shift to the side of the quote unquote superior. In these processes, images of East and West meshed with assignments of inferiority and superiority shuttled across boundaries. Now, for anybody who knows basic Turkish history a little bit, right, I'm just going to give a rundown on why that paragraph is important, right, and what also is the subtext here. I'm sure this will come up. I'm sure it's going to come up in the introduction, but I'm just going to jump ahead of it because I just like to talk. Listen, in Turkey, they had the Ottoman Empire, caliphate, ran by the Sharia, the king sort of like killed their brothers and ruled for the rest of their life. They had a big harem of women, right? Ottoman Empire lasts for hundreds of years. Some say like 700, 800 years, something like that, right? Then, World War One happens. Ottoman Empire collapses. Then this guy named Ataturk comes. He's like a secular Western type of individual who wants to lead Turkey into the modern age. And so he gets rid of the caliphate, gets rid of the caliph, changes the alphabet of Turkey from the Arabic script to the Latin script. He likes to waltz. He drinks. He bridges Turkey. He bridges the Turks between the West and the East, right? Between Islam and European society, right? And the thing is, a lot of what Ataturk did, a lot of Turks love, right? Love Turkish people love Ataturk, and you will not find a single Turkish person, unless they're a Muslim religious extremist, who will go off on Ataturk to some degree, right? Ataturk also, I find this very hard to reconcile in my mind. Ataturk knew that the Europeans had a history, I would say, because he was a very educated man, had a history of slavery, colonialism, wicked nationalism, brutality that the world has never seen. This has all come from Europe. Ataturk knew this, but still incorporated nationalism and those sorts of ideas into Turkish society, right? And so, yes, there was this sort of white worshiping that was top down instructed by Ataturk to his people, right? And yeah, I think this is something that the book will build on even more. And I'd be very interested to know what Turkish people think about that aspect of Ataturk, that he was westernizing the country, but also in a way his westernization was whitening of Turkey. Because that you cannot have westernization without whitening, and it will not also come with white supremacy. That is a part of the whole thing, right? The people of the West, of Western Europe, the whites who conquered the world, they are the ones who have the best civilization. Let's mimic them, let's copy them, copy and paste that onto Turkey, right? Continuing here. Third, the diner conversation shows that racial images and discourses of Turkishness did not remain at the level of scholarly theories, but became a significant compartment of Turkish modernization and penetrated into contemporary culture. I pay attention to a number of particular locations in which grand ideas are created, put into practice, and resisted in everyday encounters. One location will be the interactions between scholars in conferences and other venues where scholarly exchange takes place under conditions of unequal power and status. In another location, I will trace the experiences of racially marked, mainly African immigrants in the streets of Istanbul, examining how racial discourses materialize in everyday interactions. These interactions test the limits of micro/macro distinctions. They show us the fluidity of social life in that broader social forces and discourses are actualized in everyday interactions, and these interactions in turn establish the foundations of patterns and regularities. Racist political currents have always existed in the margin of the Turkish political spectrum. However, this book is more interested in the ways in which racial concepts, vocabularies, and assumptions have been entangled in mainstream governmental, intellectual, and popular discourses. In this sense, in contrast to the prevailing popular and scholarly views in Turkey, I suggest that race has never been entirely confined to the domain of marginal individuals or extreme ideologies. On the contrary, racial discourses have rarely been absent from the mainstream agendas in which Turkishness has been manufactured. This, of course, does not mean that scholars, both based in Turkey and elsewhere, entirely neglected race and ethnicity in Turkish nationalism. On the contrary, this book is inspired by a literature that examines ethnic and racial discourses, especially in early Republican Turkey. While building on this literature, I tried to emphasize the links between race and modernity more extensively, which has largely remained in the background. The desire to join Western modernity as insiders and the development of a racialized Turkishness are genetically connected. The Enlightenment promise of equal access to modernity had been waning throughout the 19th century, and in Turkey, this resulted in trends in the search for Turkish authenticity. On the one hand, liberty and equality were equally perceived as the basis of modernity. On the other hand, intellectuals in the West were engaged in a gigantic task of classifying humanity according to race, using pseudoscientific methods. It was in the context that the late Ottoman and early Republican elites realized that claiming selfhood in the modern world would not be possible without a racial affiliation. Western scientific tradition, in Turkish eyes, so successfully emphasized the correlation between whiteness and modernity that the direction of causality had effectively lost its significance. Modern nations were white. Therefore, whiteness was a prerequisite to modernize. That's exactly what I was saying before, but just more succinctly. As modernity lost its earlier universalistic appeal and was transformed into particularistic projects embedded in the context of nation states, national elites in various countries scrambled to establish the racial purity and whiteness of their national communities. Thus, racial affiliation with Europe provided a convenient and putatively foolproof method to establish one's ability to modernize. A side effect of these efforts was a mixed attitude toward the West. As the inspiration for modernization, the West was to be adored. Nevertheless, it was also to be resented, for modernizing could result in losing national identities. This tension was mitigated in the 1930s by racial vocabularies that helped create a discursive framework where Turkish modernization was presented as claiming something that was originally Turkish. Studies to prove the whiteness of Turks used arguments from race science. The combination of race with efforts of modernization carried a racialized vocabulary into the cultural terrain. Whiteness ended up being a dominant yet silent social category that inframed Turkishness and runners of race discourses in late Ottoman period maturation in early Republican period, and the contemporary era of race cultural guises beginning in the 1990s. At the center is the early Republican period, 1923 to 1950. In many ways, this is the formative era in which Turkey's contemporary identity shaped. Republican modernizers placed the image of the quote unquote West in the heart of their societal mobilization. Jumping into the comments here, Av Cree says Turkish people are mixed. That is true because all people are mixed. All people are African. All people were originally black and eventually became mixed over time. But we have to remember, Av Cree, that race is a social construct. Race is not real. There is no difference between a white person, and a black person. But Turks, by and large, identify as white. Or we will discover that in the book. I would assume that will be the image. And this was the part of their history. So Turkish people might be mixed, but their social scientists, their academics, their early thinkers in the 20th century when crafting nationality, Avkri, wanted Turkey to be considered white and wanted Turks to be considered white because they conflated modernity with whiteness. So Turks think that they're white because they assume that whiteness is closest to the top and pinnacle of civilization. So I hope that answers your question, Avkri, or corrects your statement. Because let's not just give blanket statements here. Let's actually try to challenge the text, read the text, and use our minds. Okay? Continuing here. So, Republican modernizers placed the image of the West in the heart of their societal mobilization, looking for inspiration for radical transformation and expecting a worldwide confirmation of the country's progress. The links established whiteness and modernity led to a large body of scholarship examining the racial past and future of Turks. Race theories of the period are extraordinarily colorful and defiant in their attempt to claim Western modernity on racial grounds, while fending off Western injustices, quote unquote, that had to do with the misclassification of Turks under non-white races. The lively scholarly atmosphere of the period produced a broad domain of race talk, ranging from exotic studies searching for the Mayan origins of Turks or classifying their blood types as the same as those common among white people, to more popular efforts of dissemination, mainly in textbooks, print media, and public conferences. Although the evidence for these claims comes from the Turkish context, This book is not a case study on Turkey per se, but rather focuses on how modernity functioned in the racial formation of Turkish identity by means of exchanges and interactions between European and Turkish actors. Turkish modernization relied on Europe not only as an abstract and distant model, but also in the form of direct encounters and interactions. The Turkish government invited a large number of Western experts to investigate and help with the pressing problems of the country, especially in matters of educational policy and the economy. Some of these experts stayed for relatively short periods but produced reports that had far reaching effects. Others were employed on an ongoing basis by the government. Most significantly, the government reformed the Ottoman Imperial University into a regime friendly institution in 1933 and hired a large number of Western professors, many of whom were German citizens, fleeing their homeland after the Nazi seizure of power. Ironically, these scholars entered Turkey as refugees for political or ethnic reasons. A massive scholarly mobilization emerged from the interactions and exchanges between Turkish and European scholars. Part of it was an immense scholarly search to establish ancient linguistic, racial, and historical connections between Turkishness and the West. I refer to this as the anthropometric aspect of Turkish modernization, concerned primarily with discovering the origins and essences of Turkishness in a timeless past. In contrast, the biometric aspect took these putative essential similarities to the West and differences from the rest and acted on them, creating an agenda for the protection and improvement of Turkish characteristics in the future. The biometric aspect tapped into eugenics and other hereditary research of the period that was fashionable, particularly in Germany and the United States. Just going back here from the text, I think people forget how different science was at the beginning of the early 20th century and how it is now. All reputable scientists now agree that race is not real. But back in 1921 or 1924, race was considered the defining aspect of a person. Your temperaments, your intelligence, your abilities physically, emotionally were all tied to race. Like racial science was a big deal. Phrenology was a big deal. The measuring of people's skulls and defining people by race was a very, very big deal back then. And so, what he was talking about in this paragraph is about the Turkish scientists and Turkish scholars meeting up with the intellectuals of the early 20th century who were fleeing from the from the results of racial science going to its extreme with the Nazis, taking over large swaths of Europe. They come there and they continue to try to formulate racial science to explain who the Turks are and how the modern world will run. Right. Continuing here. So, if the maturation of racial thinking took place in early Republican Turkey, its embryonic emergence has to be linked with the late Ottoman attempts to modernize the empire in the 19th century. This snapshot traces perceptions of the West and Western modernity in Turkey's imperial past. It lays the groundwork for examining how race and modernity were complementary rather than oppositional in Ottoman thinking, and how this thinking seeped into the Republican era. A major goal here is to incorporate racial discourses into Ottoman views of modernity and to illustrate the ways in which a concern with race enters into the empire through close interactions with European intellectuals. Part of the task is to analyze racially motivated Western attitudes towards Turks and how these helped to shape Turkish perceptions of Western modernity. These mutual attitudes and perceptions were significant in creating a framework in which racial discourses and assumptions would travel across imperial and national boundaries. Republican reformers were particularly sensitive to the racialized views of Turks in the West, and they were intent on correcting these views by concocting racial theories of their own. The looking glass exchanges between Turkish perceptions of the West, Western perceptions of Turks, and Turkish perceptions of Western perceptions laid the groundwork for the racial origins of Turkish identity. Basically, a situation where the West is saying, yeah, the Turks are like this because they're a separate race than us, but the Turks want to be white so bad, so they're going to say, nuh-uh, we're white because, ancient Greece was actually ancient Turkey. Even though those guys weren't there during ancient Greece, they weren't there. They were in Middle Asia somewhere, like riding on horseback, smacking broads and stuff. But yeah, they're going to try to tie themselves to whiteness and combat the racialization that the whites are doing to the Turks. And then think about this, like, because race, when you think about race deeply enough, it becomes so perplexing and confusing even when you're studying it, knowing that it is a social construct. Imagine studying race at the time these Turkish scientists were going over it and thinking that this was a real life or death thing, right? So I think there is something to be said there, and something to keep in mind as well. All right, continuing. So, the third snapshot examines contemporary Turkey. Having lost their earlier biological trappings, racial discourses today operate at the level of taste, consumption, and urban encounters. In the 1980s, global influences on Turkish society took on a new form. There was a general trend of economic and political liberalization and the beginning of the arduous process of application for full membership in the European Union. In early Republican Turkey, the image of the West shaped the course of modernization. In contemporary neoliberal Turkey, an increasingly commercialized cultural field embedded in global capitalist networks witnesses the search for alternatives to the dominant paradigm of modernization. The search for alternatives keeps its reference to the West while seeking resistance to Western domination. As this happens in tandem with increasing global flows and commercialization of culture and contemporary global conceptions of race enter into circulation with existing perceptions of Turkish whiteness. So yeah, a lot has changed since 1924. We're living in 2024, and global capitalism is making us all barely be able to pay the rent. McDonald's now costs $20 just for one person to eat a Big Mac meal. Everything's becoming more expensive, and people are tired of the LGBTQ. People are tired of minorities and immigrants and illegals and people crossing the Mediterranean. So modernization now is not in fad, right? It's totally different than it was in 1924 with nation states and the idea of borders. And eventually, in the after the end of the Cold War, people were like, yeah, we're all coming together as one global village. The internet, blue jeans, all this sort of stuff. Like now, we're in this age where people are sort of like resisting that, and they want more borders. They want more boundaries between people, right? But where does that leave race? Race is still in the question because we didn't exit the era of white supremacy. We're still in the midst, in the fog of the after effects of colonialism and white supremacy spreading across the world. So that still exists. So because Turkey is a part of the international community, and like I said, they get imported Netflix and McDonald's and all that sort of stuff, they're getting fed racialization as well. Like we read in Cyber Racism in Jesse Daniels' book, everybody is interconnected in this world, and the internet is the place, the forum where a lot of people can find their niche and get tied into people that are spreading all sorts of ideas and stuff like that. Turks are no exception. You'll find Turkish people on 4chan who are saying that they're white, their ancestors are the best, and yeah, they're not black. They're definitely not black. They'll say that, on 4chan while they look darker than me. You know what I mean? And by the way, there are no Turks that are literally darker than me unless there are Afro Turks, but you get what I'm saying, right? So yeah, what that's the thing. Like a lot of us now are looking towards our nation's past or religion, like Islam or hardcore Christianity, or just our national ideas as well, and using that as a way to craft our identity because a lot of people are not feeling modernization and globalization at the current moment. All right. So Avkri says, yeah, but if you see a Turkish person in the street, you won't realize he's Turkish at first glance. That is not the point, Avkri. Avkri is a person who cannot see past his own hand. If that's a Turkish saying, I hope it is. Avkri, you are missing the forest for the tree. We are not talking about if Turkish people look white. We are talking about if they are categorized as white and how whiteness became a creation. Now, Avkri, I assume you're a person who is not black, and I assume also that you're a person who has not done critical studies of race and what blackness means and the creation of our modern world through white supremacy. I assume that you're a person like that. Being white is not real. There is no such thing as a white person because there is literally nobody that is translucent. But there is such a thing as whiteness as a social construct. Now, do Turks fit the social construct of what we identify as white? Some do, but others don't. But by and large, Turks are classified as white. How did that come to be? Why is that so? And what can we do to change it? Because whiteness should be abolished. Continuing here. Continuing here. All right. So Av Creed sent another comment. That's why I said you won't realize he's Turkish because he is the category of white people. But what is whiteness? Avkri, I'm going to ask you, what is whiteness? Because whiteness is more than just what somebody looks like. Because if the Turks were white, wouldn't they be in the EU by now? Turkey has a large economy, is geostrategically important. It's a nation that has abundant resources that the EU needs. Why wouldn't Turkey? Is there something that is missing? Is there something that's missing that's making the Turks not being able to be accepted into the club of white folks? You get what I'm saying? Being white is more than just looking white. Being white is more than just looking white. Ask the Arabs. A lot of Arabs look white. A lot of Arabs look white. How is that working out for them? You get what I'm saying? We are talking about what whiteness means and how it was created in Turkey, right? Because whiteness is not real. Whiteness is not real. But Avcree, you won't answer the question what actually is white, because I doubt you've ever even thought about that. What is white? All right, continuing here. So the discourse with which identity battles are fought has changed over time, but the substantive issues. Sorry, got a class thing I'm working on. Okay. So the discourse with which identity battles are fought has changed over time, but the substantive issues have tended to linger. Minority rights, the content of Turkishness, negotiating a national culture in a global world, and formulations of citizenship. Therefore, in the process of the contemporary identity search, several issues implicitly or explicitly touch on the racial legacy of the early Republican period. Correspondingly, in order to appreciate the legacy, we need to pay attention to the linkages between race and Turkish modernity. Today, the ghost of early Republican racial discourses still haunts cultural debates, despite the conspicuous absence of any explicit treatment of race. Racial terminology tended to disappear from serious scholarship in the 1950s, and many who show an interest in early Republican racial vocabularies proceed as if they are dealing with a historical relic rather than a current issue. However, this disappearance only marks the conversion of these racial assumptions into cultural forms. Here I rely on critical race theory and critical white studies to pursue the resurfacing of racial vocabularies in a different register in contemporary Turkey. Critical race theorists have illustrated the taken for granted and concealed nature of whiteness as an identity. Racial assumptions, such as the superiority of whiteness, lie dormant in the interstices of culture and erupt into visible existence only when provoked. All right, continuing here. The racial assumptions underlying contemporary Turkish identity manifest themselves in two distinct forms: immutability and chromatism. By immutability, I refer to the way in which Turkishness is imagined as a category that defies historical transformation. Only after racial immutability successfully attaches itself to Turkishness and constructs itself as a static identity do subtle differences between true belonging and mere citizenship makes sense. For example, Turkic peoples of Central Asia are considered to belong to the Turkish world, whereas Turkish citizens of minority origins are considered foreigners, and immigration practices throughout the Republican era have favored Muslims of Turkish culture over other groups. Textbooks in contemporary Turkey still propagate Turkishness, even in its cultural formations, as an unchanging entity. In other words, immutability means that the limits of Turkishness stretch beyond citizenship. The second aspect of racialized Turkishness is studied less: the pervasive chromatic fascination with skin color and other physiogenomic characteristics. Chromatism reflects the tendency in early Republican scholarly discourses to subscribe to rather superficial generalizations with regard to racial characteristics, while their Western counterparts were either leaning toward more sophisticated measures of racial differences, such as IQ scores, or questioning the concept of race entirely. Early Republican scholars remained content with examining skin color, craniological measurements, and blood types. Focusing on chromatism allows us to analyze this immense interest in race science and its contemporary manifestations, not as a full-fledged body of structural hierarchies, but as an eclectic collection of symbols that act as a stable anchor in the treacherous waters of modernity. Debates in contemporary Turkey, ranging from the hierarchies of taste between quote unquote white and quote unquote dark Turks to the perceptions of Africans, reveal intrinsic links with the Republican fascination with whiteness. Whiteness maintains a crucial symbolic role in Turkish debates around culture, class, lifestyle, and status. Basically, with chromatism, and that's a very useful word, by the way, it's basically the type of stuff Av Cree is saying in the chat. Turks look white. Turks got blonde hair. Some got blue eyes. Some got red hair. Some got freckles on their cheeks. Yeah, Turks are white because they look white. But whiteness is more than just what somebody looks like. There are many parts and aspects. Because if whiteness was all about what somebody looks like, the early Italians and Greeks that immigrated to America would have been considered white as soon as they hopped off the boat. But it's not that. Continuing here. So, part of the task of this book is to think about the conceptual complexity of race in terms of its variations and overlaps across settings and historical periods, while paying attention to the specificities of the particular setting in Turkey. It is important to see how racial discourses have a large circulation, especially in terms of overflows into the cultural domain. I describe a particular type of racial operation that is fascinated with skin color and other marks of appearance, that constantly denies its very existence and buries itself deep into the hidden corners of everyday culture and life, but that loosely associates itself with more outright institutional and state-sponsored forms of discrimination. This is both familiar and unfamiliar. To account for these complexities, I rely on three extensions. The first extension takes place across time. In my work, I tend to take temporal snapshots of racial discourses in three distinct historical periods: the late Ottoman period, the early Republic, and the contemporary era, the post 1990s. As much as racial conceptions, true to their immense power to transform, shift across these periods, continuities and legacies also tend to persist. Contemporary racial understandings in Turkey make sense only in the context of the formation of whiteness as one of the dominant storylines in the long history of modernization. Although race today may not appear frequently in public debates, gut-level racial classifications inspired and inscribed by previous scholarly mobilizations flow over into the cultural domain. The second extension takes place across space. Racial discourses in contemporary Turkey interact not only with the past, but also with a collection of globally flowing racial signifiers. Perceptions of race today travel across boundaries, especially given the transplantation of certain types of popular culture in diverse settings outside of their original cultural milieus. This is nothing new. As it was the case in late Ottoman and early Republican periods, racial discourses in the Turkish context always interacted with the West, both as a conceptual entity and, as in the case of emigre scholars in the 1930s, as flesh and blood individuals. Racial formations have always been globalized, but perhaps today the spread of popular culture is at unprecedented levels. I said that before about everybody's watching Netflix and reading the same comic books, right? Everybody goes sees the new Marvel movie, right? All right, so the third extension takes place across theory. Anglo-American academic hegemony operates along an implicit global division of labor in which theory production takes place in the center, and the rest of the world provides interesting cases to quote-unquote test these theories. Building theoretical connections between racial vocabularies in Turkey and the scholarship on race and whiteness can be a two-way process in the sense that the persistent presence of race in connection with modernity in Turkey has the potential for contributing to a global scholarship on race while maintaining linkages with other accounts of race, racism, and racialization. Only by paying attention to a multitude of cases in a truly global exchange of theoretical and empirical models can we account for the global variations of racial discourses. A large collection of cases that does not privilege Western experiences paves the way to establish transnational linkages, hence dwelling upon spatial connections without losing sight of the local manifestations of racial discourses. It is equally important to place contextual specificity into broader theoretical debates. Despite its almost exclusive affinity with North American scholarship, critical race theory offers an important tool to understand the conceptual and autonomy and taken for granted nature of race and whiteness. So I'm just going to summarize my understanding of those last two paragraphs. Basically, we're going to study race at different spaces, at different times, in a globalized way, keeping in mind that, a lot of this stuff is under the cover. A lot of this stuff is hidden beneath people, and they don't know that they have racialization in them, or they understand the rules and boundaries of race until they actually have to express them. So that's how I'm interpreting those two paragraphs. Let's jump into chapter 1. Chapter 1 of this book is The Turk, a White Man. All right. So, why this book should not have been written. Race in the Turkish case. Race is a tough sell in and for the Turkish context. Throughout my research for this book, apart from those who were helpful and enthusiastic. I met a number of people who were suspicious, if not outright hostile, to the idea of race as a framework to study Turkey's experience with modernization. The response is not surprising considering the bad name race acquired in contemporary world. The nature of the objection was somewhat different from what a scholar of race could hear in the context of the United States. That is, that studying race reproduces racial hierarchies. Mm. In my case, the fear was more along the lines of confusing race with racist. Talking about racial discourses, according to this position, could potentially indicate that the Turkish state is racist. The rest of the book, of course, will elaborate why I believe racial discourses have left an unmistakable mark on Turkish identity and why racism must be a distinct issue. But I would like to begin by acknowledging some of the objections I received when I explained the book project to interested parties. So, this is one of the tricks of white supremacy, or people who buy into whiteness, or people who buy into nationalism, and they are not committed to fighting for racial justice or economic justice or justice, period, for all groups of people, right? The number one thing people want to protect is their nation. Because when people start talking about anti blackness in a state context, people automatically jump up and say, there is no racism in X country. There is no racism in Poland. There is no racism in Russia. There is no anti blackness in Brazil. There is no racism in Turkey. People automatically put up their guard and try to block it out, right? Because they are more concerned with protecting their nation than actually dealing with the issue front on, right? So a lot of the times people don't want to talk about race, racism, blackness, white supremacy in their state's context. They're good at pointing out it in another context, in another place, say, yeah, racism only exists in Germany. Racism only exists in the West. Racism can only exist in a state or in a place or a time or amongst people that are descendants from chattel slavery of the transatlantic slave trade. This is like how some people think. They say Italy could never be racist because we never had slavery, right? Something like that. It's crazy things people say, right? So this is the thing, right? I could understand immediately. I already know what this chapter is going to say. I didn't read it ahead of time, but I'm pretty sure people don't want to talk about race or racism in Turkey because the first thing they want to do is protect Turkey. And the crazy thing is, this only applies to blackness and talking about anti-blackness. Because if we were to talk about sexism, there are tons of Turkish people that will talk to you all day about the anti-woman sexism that exists in Turkey. If we're going to talk about religious extremism, there are people that will talk to you all day about religious extremism, right? But when it comes to anti-blackness, it's crazy that's a taboo topic, and all the people want to do is deny it and push it into the closet, right? And that's a big problem. If we're talking about homophobia, there are people that will talk about homophobia all day. Nobody reputable would look you in the eyes and say that there is no anti-gay or lesbian bigotry in Turkey. But they will look you dead in the eyes as a black person or a person talking about this subject or studying this subject and say there is no anti-black racism in Turkey. Think about that. There can be sexism there, homophobia there, religious bigotry, ethnic bigotry, but there is no anti-black racism. Does that even make sense? Does that even make sense? Doesn't. It doesn't. But let's continue here. The views of naysayers are significant in two ways. First, I learned a lot from them because they offer a glimpse into the way Turkish history and its racial legacy have been perceived in Turkey. Second, the pleas to forget about the race talk in the Turkish past as a bizarre but trivial episode helped me grasp the importance and taken for granted nature of the subject matter. It was the naysayers who convinced me to look into the contradiction between empirical data and their popular explanations. Criticisms of the central theme of this book point to an awareness of Turkey's past, no matter how misinformed it appears. However, a considerable number of people do not possess information beyond what is taught in elementary and high school education. The Turkish education system tends to emphasize a unilinear historical narrative in which the troublesome imperial past ends with a whimper, only to be superseded with a quantum leap of modernization single-handedly accomplished by a cadre of charismatic elites. As I can tell from my own experiences, students both learn too intensely. All courses and activities revolve around the history of the Republic and the Turkish Reformation, as this information is constantly repeated, and too superficially. Historical events that do not fit the dominant pattern are conspicuously omitted. By the way, Turkish people are not taught about their history of slavery as well that happened in the Ottoman Empire. So that's also another thing that can lead to them not knowing about or not considering the anti-blackness that exists in their society. Continuing here, I can imagine that for the majority of the people who, as I once did, take what they learn at schools for granted, racial discourses of the past simply do not exist. After all, students grow up hearing about the constitutional character of Turkish citizens, of Turkish citizenship, which is not necessarily incorrect, without learning about the incidents of discrimination against certain groups that would at best complicate the ideal typical picture of civic citizenship. In such a milieu, the subject matter of this book has great potential to be misunderstood. For the less educated, which unfortunately includes a considerable number of high school and university graduates, the subject matter of a book on Turkishness and race must deal only with the glory and heroism of Turks, their contributions to world history, and the sinister plans of internal and external enemies against Turks. For the more informed, the topic of race and Turkishness conceals an insulting chapter in the past that should have been forgotten long ago. For the latter group, racial discourses in Republican history and their manifestations in scholarship, as well as in the popular media, were nothing but aberrations of a volatile time. I grew used to hearing about long forgotten crazy scientists who certainly had extreme views, but who were acting only as marginalized individuals. Such a view insists on a sense of discontinuity that is not unusual in a part of the historiography of the Republican era. Racial discourses emerge out of nowhere in the 1930s. A group of scholars whom nobody takes seriously today experiments with them for a while, but the entire body of race talk disappears into oblivion after the end of World War II. The last decade witnessed changes to the prominence of race in public debates. A book published in 2005 on racist anthropologists in the 1920s and 1930s generated intense scholarly debates concerning the role of race and racism in understanding Turkish identity. The assimilation, the assimilationist policies towards ethnic and religious minorities in the 1930s appeared in public debates about race and racism, especially when the ruling government of the Justice and Development Party, AKP, drew attention to them. Incidents of police brutality toward African immigrants generated charges of racism from activists. In contemporary Turkey, there is an increasing reception toward entertaining race and racism as a conceptual framework to understand prejudice and discrimination. Despite all, race is still a phantom, an image that appears in moments of crisis only to recede quickly to the background. The objections to place Turkish identity along with racialized thinking is still too strong. Mm. So, the following is a more detailed list of the reasons why I was told I should not have written this book. This is so Turkish. This is so Turkish to write your first chapter on why you shouldn't do something. I'm such a bad boy. I'm so bad for writing a book about racism. I shouldn't do it. I should not do it. Sasha Khan jumped into the chat. One of my favorite subscribers, intellectual young man. He says, when I went to Turkey, some people looked Middle Eastern and thus could be instantly discriminated against on these grounds, while others looked quote unquote white European. Yes, there are Turks that look white, but we're talking about the conception of whiteness, how whiteness was created in Turkey, and why some Turks view themselves as white, or why they thought it was important to identify as white, and how also anti-blackness exists in their society, because it exists in all societies, right? But thank you, Sasha Khan, for your comment, and continue to comment as we read through this book. So, continuing in chapter 1, why I shouldn't have written this book. Don't make your own look bad. I'm sure that's a Turkish saying. A curious ritual takes place in Turkey after each game. A Turkish soccer club or the national team plays a European counterpart. Newspapers publish mostly positive accounts of the game in the European media, usually under headings such as, "What did the British press say?" Even the most serious dailies participate in this ritual, in which the story of the game appears twice, once from their perspective. Although in both cases, the focus is on the Turkish side. No one seems to be concerned with our or their accounts of the other team. If this is That's so weird. If this is an instance of the phenomenon of the looking glass self, in which others' opinions function as a mirror to construct a sense of identity and to manufacture a certain judgment about ourselves, the looking glass in the Turkish media is more likely a one way mirror. The "what did they say" syndrome also raises its head on every November 10th when the death of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, founder of Turkey, is commemorated. Newspapers, web pages, and blogs witness a list of short statements by foreign, but mostly European and North American individuals that serve as testament to the greatness of Ataturk. The authenticity of statements is never questioned. Sources or dates of these statements are never supplied. Names of foreign leaders, authors, or scientists are occasionally misspelled, if not outright invented. Praise by a Westerner for the founder of Turkey is accepted on its face value. All right, Acti jumped into the comments. My beautiful, beautiful Turkish wife. During my education, we overly talk about nationality, but never about race. Like, even what is our race as Turkish people? I think that's what the question of this book is going towards, Acti. And I think most likely, Turks by and large identify as white or some offshoot of white when they definitely do not identify as black. And what we will see from the academics of the early 20th century who were in Turkey, they were hell bent on making sure Turks were associated with whiteness because whiteness was tied to modernity. All right. But yeah, continuing here. There is also no doubt that the West, however it is perceived in Turkey, operates as the main and perhaps the only audience for the achievements of Turkish modernity. Any intellectual activity that is conceived of along the lines of exhuming skeletons in the country's closet, regardless of whether the conception is true or not, raises suspicion. No wonder I was cautioned more than once to be careful about how to present Turkish history for international audiences. The West, construed as the ultimate arbiter of Turkey's modernity, renders revisionist attempts contentious and political. The roots of persistent anti intellectualism in Turkish history and its recent manifestation, especially with Turkey's application for a full European Union membership, can be traced to the strained relationship with the West as the audience of modernization. Studying your own presents particular challenges in this context. The dichotomy of scholarly detachment and political involvement is bound to emerge in a work that deals with race, modernity, and early Republican Turkey. The study of cultural history is inherently political because issues of power are entangled in the interstices of discourses and practices that social scientists attempt to understand. The way that knowledge was produced, disseminated, and classified throughout the early Republican period has important implications in terms of the formation of contemporary identities and of establishing the limits of what is discursively possible and powerful. Perhaps taking Michael Foucault's advice, we should abandon a whole tradition that allows us to imagine that knowledge can exist only where the power relations are suspended and that knowledge can develop only outside its injunctions, its demands, and its interests. Perhaps it is time to question the boundary between detachment and involvement and instead to use this tension to produce knowledge that strives for detachment from the subject matter, yet places detachment itself into its own historical context. The type of racial/cultural discourse on which this book concentrates operates in widely dispersed, concealed, and complex ways. The challenge in this case is to conceive of scholarly engagement not simply an act of taking sides, but of digging deep, uncovering what is unseen, and disentangling what is complex. Although the task involves critical engagement, it entails neither concocting a detached position and disinterested knowledge, nor representing the interest of a specific group. Instead of legislating as to the relative merits of discourses, contemporary intellectuals should make sure the conversation keeps going by interpreting one discursive framework into another. Sometimes the key to understanding a contemporary debate lies in the hands of an already forgotten past. In these moments, a caution such as "don't make your own kind look bad," rather than disheartening its targets, fits into a discursive context where it makes sense. So basically, summarizing all of that there, he's basically saying, I'm not doing this research to make my people look bad, and I'm not doing it to try to not make them look bad. I'm doing it to engage honestly with the topic. And just the question or just the statement, are you trying to make your look are you trying to make your people look bad, or do you want to make your people look bad, or don't make your people look bad? Any of those statements or questions serve a purpose in studying this as well. So we should not be afraid to challenge these ideas. And this is the point of having the Book React series. This is the point of all the scholarship that I try to do on this channel, the meager scholarship I do by reading to y'all, bringing y'all stories, doing my own writing as well, the activities outside I do of class, and my live streams as well. All of this is for the purpose of moving the narrative forward and actually challenging ourselves by engaging with these topic we are studying. So, Acti says, when I was younger, I also had the weird European complex, but as time passed, I feel more Middle Eastern than white. But yeah, most Turks do view themselves as white. But even then, all racial categories, right? Because Middle Eastern might be a racialized category. Even then, I would say Middle Eastern is a racialized category put in context with whiteness, right? Because once again, race is not real. It's not real, but it all starts from blackness and whiteness, and then everything else fits in between in its proximity to whiteness. So even saying that I identify as Middle Eastern, or I identify as Asian or Arab, whatever, right? All of these things sit in the spectrum of understanding race to some degree, and that's not to say that somebody has to like pick a side or pick a place or make it or have a seat, right? But it is saying that in a world where as long as white supremacy exists, and as long as these categorizations of people exist, you will you will, whether by your own volition, by your own choice or not, you will have to like pick a side, if that makes sense, or deal with the consequences of being put into a side, if that makes sense, right? Uh, Continuing here. So, the implicit and explicit classification of nationalisms into good or bad versions can be traced back to the tendency in earlier studies on nationalism to distinguish Eastern and Western types. This pernicious dichotomy later surfaced in other guises: civic versus ethnic, territorial versus genealogical, or libertarian versus authoritarian. These ideal typical depictions lack historical specificity, obscure the complexity of actual forms of nationalism, and are unable to account for the complexity of in between cases that defy reduction to simple categories. While the question of whether nationalism is good or bad does not have much analytical value, such an evaluative tendency in the literature indicates that quote unquote colonial dichotomies of civilized slash barbaric and advanced slash primitive have not been transcended. They have been only relabeled as modern slash traditional or Western versus ethnic. Scholars have thoroughly criticized the dichotomy of good and bad nationalisms. For example, see Yak 1996, Schnapper 1998, Ozmir, I hope I pronounced that Turkish name right, 2005. However, I have encountered its more popular forms during my research for this book. In the Turkish case, the typology of good and bad and its other manifestations, such as civic, and ethnic, has the additional work of associating Turkish nationalism with Western characteristics, and only then de emphasizing its putatively and undesirable aspects, such as the use of racial vocabularies, as aberrations that have nothing to do with the routine workings of civic nationalism. The dichotomy of good versus bad is so essential that it will figure in more than one of the following reasons as to why I should not have written this book. Clearly, studying your own in the Turkish case, especially with regard to a potentially contentious topic, presents particular challenges. One of the most prevalent is to resist the tendency to have your work labeled as either a pro or anti Republican account of the past. You focus only on the negative aspects, someone may say. Or that's what I get all the time in my comment section. Why you only talk about racism? Because your community continues to practice racism. That's why. Continuing. You only focus on the negative aspects, nigga. Stop it, nigga. Someone may say. Or Western countries have worse examples of racism in that period. Talk about the West, nigga. Do not talk about Turkey, nigga. As if scholarship is a competition to show the world who is bad and how bad they are. Setting the historical record straight is, of course, crucial, but the obligatory moral baggage of good or bad simply hampers critical evaluations of discursive formations and their consequences. In this book, I hope to go beyond simply organizing a parade of good or bad examples. Instead, it is important. It is important to investigate the systemic characteristics of the Republican past in which constitutional citizenship coexisted with racial discourses and inclusive declarations were countered by exclusive policies. In this sense, the good and the bad presuppose rather than oppose each other. All right. Continuing here, race is a foreign concept. It is not in Turkey, nigga. Do not write this book. We do not have race in Turkey. I do not see color, brother. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he had a black friend 1,400 years ago. His name was Bilal, and since then, the Muslims have not seen race. We have not seen race. This is why the Muslims walk 7 times around the Kaaba, because we do not know where exactly we are going. So we have to make sure we do it a few times to make sure that we are following the rules that Allah gave us, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blinded all the Muslims to race, brother. And that's why in Turkey, in Morocco, in Iraq, in Jordan, in Egypt, all the people who are dark are poor. That's why all the darkies in Tunisia and Algeria can barely get good jobs, nigga, because we do not see color. I cannot see color to help my African brothers, nigga. I had to do it. I had to do it. I'm sorry. I had to go off on that. I hate that. I hate that so much. There is no racism in our country because we do not see color, brother. Anyway, continuing. This is both the opposite and the twin of the first concern. Don't make your own look bad originates from an admiration of an imagined Western audience while delegating judgment to the West. A fundamental paradox here is that the same West that is admired for its potency is also feared for its capabilities of intrusion. The significance of this love-hate relationship for Turkish modernization will become apparent in following chapters. A more urgent task, however, is to dissect the implications of borrowing conceptual tools across different cases. Does that entail scholarly colonization? National and ethnic identities, which in themselves may be considered foreign concepts in the Turkish context, are widely studied. The problem to overcome in any comparative work is to build theoretical linkages across empirically disparate cases. Race, as a concept, has a particular way of denying these connections. The persuasive power of racial discourses depends on the apparent transparency or self-evidence on their being taken for granted, whether as something unquestioned or as something repressed. A major goal of this book is to make the transparent visible, to interrogate and reveal the particular ways in which the discourse of the racial unity of Turkish people has succeeded to the extent that race has turned into an unmarked, denied, ignored, yet central category in Turkish culture. It is largely its power of denial and disguise that helps race masquerade as irrelevant in the Turkish context. Historical sociology takes contextual differences seriously while attempting to build connections across cases. The linkages can be built around circulating individuals, ideas, and things, as well as around common conceptual frameworks, such as race and whiteness, while recognizing the need for not losing sight of the particularities embedded in a specific historical context, a delicate balance indeed. The absence of quote unquote raced frameworks, both in some of the scholarly disciplines as well as in popular perceptions, can partially be traced back to a lack of this balance. Turkey's particularities are overemphasized at the expense of conceptual and empirical links. All too frequently, Turkey is represented as an exceptional country with a unique history of modernization, a unique democracy, and a unique identity. Such quote unquote methodological nationalism is anathema not only in the contemporary globalizing world in general, but also in the early Republican Turkish context in particular, where the motion of individuals, objects, and ideas across national boundaries was anything but unusual. The following chapters will attest to the amount of transnational exchange between Turkey and other contexts. Consequently, race and whiteness, more than being alien impositions, interact with the specifications of the Turkish settling, while at the same time with the specificities of the Turkish setting, not settling, while at the same time maintaining a level of conceptual consistency. I'll read that again. Consequently, race and whiteness, more than being alien impositions, interact with the specificities of the Turkish setting while at the same time maintaining a level of conceptual consistency. Excellent, excellent. All right, water break. All right, got to stay hydrated. Continuing here, we only got about 10 more pages to go, and then we're going to wrap this up. Like I said, we're only reading chapter 1 and the introduction today, but hopefully you stay tuned, and you will continue to delve into this book with me, and we will challenge it and be challenged by it. All right, so my response to the challenges of treading the fine but crucial line between the empirical specificity of a case and establishing theoretically meaningful shared frameworks of analysis revolves around the concept of quote unquote linked particularities. I use both theoretical concepts such as race and the methodological tools such as a case study loosely in ways that warrant flexibility and accommodate empirical linkages, the exchange of ideas, the motion of individuals and things across various borders, the most porous of which being national ones. This attention to movement helps this study in two ways. First, Turkey ceases to be a well defined entity with its own logic and instead emerges as a nebulous collection of discourses, actions, relationships, individuals, and things that move back and forth. Rather than the limitations of a bounded case, I work on a setting defined not by its borders, but by the motion of people and things attached to it in one way or another. This is how a Swiss professor of anthropology, for example, can become a significant part of the Turkish case. Second, this approach does not violate the sense of historical contingency and empirical particularity that one expects from a historically nuanced study, challenging the putative borders that encircles cases and stressing the interactions and interconnection of ideas, people, and things do not de-emphasize attention to historical detail and particularity. It is the linkages between particularities that present a comparative framework, not the uniformity across bounded entities. Such a framework has the potential to account for the unique nature of historical phenomenon while connecting them within a network of cases. The taxonomy of racial differences and whiteness makes sense in the Turkish case, not only in terms of empirical reality of linkages, but also in terms of the theoretical frameworks of modernization, which turn racial discourses into a constellation ready to address local issues and concerns. It is this moment of encounter and interaction, both empirically and theoretically, that warrants focusing on race in Turkish context. So, race merely means nation. We don't have racism in Turkey, brother. We are only concerned with race, as in it means the nation. We want Turkish people first. What does a Turkish person look like? Oh, well, let me tell you. I don't know. I'm going off right now. You feel me? Anyway, continuing. Some of the Nay's arguments meant lineage or pedigree in early Republican Turkey, as opposed to, for example, a Darwinian subspecies or similarity in genetic outlook. The distinction between race and nation in this context is not entirely conceptual. There is an implicit emotional appeal lurking in the background that is similar to the distinctions between and civic forms in the literature of nationalism. Just as civic nationalism is used to distinguish quote unquote good forms of nationalism from its ethnic, that is, bad forms, the argument that race means nation pursues an implicitly defensive agenda against the bad reputation of race, despite the argument's explicit goal of conceptual clarity. Race means nation draws an unreal boundary between the two concepts. It is true that nation conflates other forms of group identification, such as ethnicity and race, to such an extent that the quote unquote concept never functions alone. The good versus bad division of labor between nation and race is far from clear cut in many settings. The Japanese language, for example, does not differentiate between race and cultural/slash history. Therefore, the euphemistic employment of nation to replace race underestimates the latter's impressive capacity for mutation and self denial. Even if an entire discourse of racial classification can be disregarded for being a representation of quote unquote nation, ethnicity, lineage, or another term, the hybridity and mutability of race precludes us from manufacturing sharp boundaries between race and other related concepts. Race maintains continuous conversations with other concepts of inclusion and exclusion, instead of producing only biological hierarchies. Despite the overlaps between race and nation, the founding literature on nationalism tends either to marginalize race as an aberration in nationalism or to acknowledge the significance of race only in certain quote unquote bad forms of nationalism. However, the maintenance of racial hegemonies occurs within the institutional and discursive framework of nationalism. My interpretation of this text, right, when people say race and nationalism are hand in hand, he is saying that that is not the case, right? Just basic common logic will tell you that somebody could be of a different racial category, but not be a part of said nation, right? Like you have Koreans, right, who grew up in Japan, and even though some people might say Koreans and Japanese look the same and they're the same race, to the Japanese, no, they are not. They are not the same race. They are from a different nation, different lineage, and therefore they are not of our racial hierarchy, right, or racial categories. Within the Balkans, like all I gotta say is Balkans, and you can put two and two together, right? We have the Romani people throughout Europe, who, while they belong to certain nationalities, do not fit into the racial boxes of chromatism that would be assigned to the people that those nations are known for, right? If you follow what I'm saying, right? So there are many ways that nation and race contradict, and while you often cannot talk about nationalism without talking about race, you cannot talk about race without talking about nationalism, right? As well, and the nation as a whole, right? Um, yeah, he mentioned here that the early scholars often tried to discount race as an important part of building the nation. But as we're seeing, right, the nation state oftentimes is built along race, but race can exist without the nation, right? Race can exist without the nation, because there have been wide swaths of categories of people defined as one race. The Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, they are all generally defined as one race in certain contexts, right? I hope I'm absolutely clear, and I'm going to watch this in the playback just to make sure that I'm saying everything right. But keep in mind, guys, this series is called Book React. So there's somebody who spent hours of their life and time doing research on a book, and I'm giving my gut reaction to the text. So not everything I say might exactly be right and exact, as I'm still, challenging the thoughts in my head and allowing the ideas of the book to permeate within me. But I'm giving my raw, honest reaction to the text and how I'm rationalizing it as we read, if you follow me. So, continuing here. Relegating race to the status of a replacement for nation ignores historical complexity by refusing to take the perspectives of social actors seriously. The race talk of early Republican Turkey has to be taken seriously. The first step for that is to go beyond what race meant and ask what race did. Race has an ability to define and to set limits for what is acceptable, limits that go beyond prejudice and discrimination. Racial discourses impose cultural and social taxonomies, distinguish quote unquote normal from abnormal in a both inclusive and exclusive process, and form immutable identities. The idea of the natural and the timeless, harbored by racial classifications, reproduces a sense of belonging and alienness, so that group formation seems destined as eternal, faded, as unchanging and unchangeable. The linkages between race and nation are not historical accidents, but theoretical necessities, because nationalism's dominant conceptual partners are not simply nation and state. They are also race and alien, for without the racialized kind of alien, there can be no national kin. Deep. Even in the absence of the term race, nationalist projects of inclusion and exclusion could use racialized criteria. Hence, race talk is not a requirement for the operation of racial discourses, especially when race seeps into the cultural domain. All right, continuing here. Turkish nationalism had no resentment toward the West. National modernization in post colonial countries incorporates high levels of hostility and resentment toward their former colonizers, that is, the West, which ultimately seriously taint the adoption of Westernization. Turkey, as the argument goes, did not suffer from resentment because it was never colonized. It is true that post colonial nationalisms imagine their identities as distinct and even oppressed, and sorry, It is true that post colonial nationalisms imagine their identities as distinct and even opposed to what they perceive as the West, while at the same time delineating Westernization as the only viable strategy to oppose the power of their former colonizers. This paradox of authenticity and Westernization poses challenges, since the very idea of Western modernity has been constructed as the negation of its other, the colonial subject. Sentiments of resentments that emerge out of experiences of subordination, some scholars argue, push late modernizations toward primordial identifications, such as race and ethnicity. Countries that imported nationalism and imitated it had to experience resentment, a feeling of anger and hatred toward the source of importation, since the original model, by definition, was superior to the imported form. It is possible then to consider Turkey as an anomalous case in which a non colonized, late modernizing country eschewed the post colonial paradox and adopted modernity without its corresponding baggage of resentment. My criticism of the quote unquote lack of resentment argument revolves around both empirical and theoretical levels. Empirically speaking, can we argue that Turkey's non colonial status restrained feelings of resentment? Is it true that Turkish modernization was strictly endogenous? Endogenous? Sorry, so as to eliminate perceptions of Western imposition and intrusion. It would be a mistake to reduce the discursive and material presence of the West to the institutional arrangement of colonialism. Even though Republican modernization appears to be a wholehearted attempt to switch civilizations, it is difficult to neglect equally strong reactions to perceived Western imposition. Let us remember that modernity was imported into Turkey's imperial precursor, the Ottoman Empire, through Western diplomatic pressure, economic domination, and periodic wars to such an extent that the entire process can be summed as the growing influence of Europe in the Ottoman Empire and the reactions it brought about in the Ottoman state and society. Feelings of intrusion survived in the Republican period after a war of independence between 1919 and 1923 that is even today considered to be fought against the West. It is no surprise that a discourse of penetration, which in fact resulted in a portrayal of Westernization as acquiring the weapons of the enemy, lingered. Interesting. Interesting. Basically, what he's trying to say is that, in Mali, in Niger, in Chad, in Burkina Faso, they're kicking out the French because they're still pissed off about the colonialism that happened not that long ago in people's lifetimes. I believe many of these African nations got free from France in the 1950s and 60s. So around the time your grandmother is still alive. If your grandmother's still around, she might have been reading the newspaper and seeing, hey, Niger gets his freedom, right? So in Turkey, it's a bit different because they were never colonized, but the Europeans did try to carve up Turkey. They tried to invade Turkey because the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe. They did not modernize their weapons and their tactics in war. So the Europeans pounced when they thought they had the chance. And that's when Ataturk sort of led the war of independence. Now, the story goes to Turkish people in their mind that they sort of modernized because they kicked out the Europeans and then they said, you know what, let's try to be better than the Europeans. Let's take their technology, take their culture, take their things and make it our own with our own twist of Turkishness and modernize, build factories, get rid of, women having to wear the hijab and all that sort of stuff. Like, let's become modern. But Ergen is saying, like, no, the very fact that the Europeans invaded Turkey forced Turkey into modernization. This is a form no different of the type of modernization that was imported into those African nations, right? And the resentment is there, which is why Turkey modernized, right? The resentment against the West is still there. And I would argue that's just, it's just so obvious, right? That resentment towards the West is there, particularly now in Turkey, where the European Union is like playing games with Turkey. Erdogan also doesn't want to play by the EU rules, but yet and still, there is some, I would say, resentment but adoration for the West in Turkey from my interactions with Turkish people, and I'll leave it at that. Continuing here. As far as resentment is concerned, the reformist elite were painfully aware of the negative images of the Turks in the Western imagination, an image that had deep roots in historical encounters and conflicts. The quote unquote terrible Turk, the scourge of Europe, and the sick man of Europe were powerful tropes that circulated in Europe and later in North America, largely in reaction to the Ottoman involvement in Europe and the age old association of the Turk with the Muslim. There are perceptions of perceptions, but they played an important role in the formation of Turkey's identity and gave modernization in Turkey its anti Western rhetorical ammunition. Republican modernizers were also aware that Turkey's stereotypical presentations as an uncivilized land were fundamentally racial. Western images referred to permanent dispositions rather than to temporary conditions. Parts of this book deals with the sense of resentment toward the West in Turkey, but suffice it to say that exactly contrary to the lack of resentment thesis, the emergence of racial vocabularies in Turkey was in part a response to the racial images of the subhuman Turk, as well as to perceptions of intrusion and injustice. Charges of Western misconceptions, misunderstandings, and injustices periodically rise to the levels of social paranoia, says Akcham, 2002, page 55, which has its roots in this volatile period where the imperial power of the Ottomans was lost to what was considered to be Western manipulation and trickery. The Republican elites were left with a considerably weaker country in an insecure world and with the feeling that the lonely Turks had to take on an entire world conspiring against them. Once the Turkish ambivalence towards modernity is acknowledged, it becomes clear that racial vocabularies are not antithetical to modernization efforts. On the contrary, race and modernization are cooperative rather than competitive phenomena. Resentment toward the West did not result in the wholesale abandonment of the project of modernity. What we instead see in the Turkish context are attempts to incorporate and twist the racialized language of Western modernity and turn it into locally useful forms. Throughout this book, I pay particular attention to the bonds between race and modernity and how, in the Turkish context, it is operated to confront the paradox of importing modernity while making it appear native. Even in the context of the late Ottoman period in the 19th century, elites realized the importance of racial affiliations in a world where the Enlightenment promise of equal chances for modernization was quickly fading. Nationalist elites all around the world scrambled to establish their racial purity and fitness for a modernity that portrayed its subjects as exclusively white, male, European, and bourgeois. What emerged in Turkey was a project to resemble the pieces of globally disseminated modernity in such a way that it would end up importing something that the Turks actually had invented originally. The side effect of this was an admittedly creative yet schizophrenic approach to the West as both a friend and foe, a source of inspiration for modernization, and the devil that can steal your authentic soul. Very poetic. Very poetic. I like the way this man writes. I like the way this man writes. This is a challenging book. I would argue this book is more challenging than Jesse Daniels' Cyber Racism, the other book we read, but he writes very well. Like it. There are some typos in here too. Missing the infinitives. Missing the infinitives in certain verbs. I've noticed that. So, race claims were not biological enough. Other naysayers argued that the scholarly race talk in early Republican Turkey and its popular manifestations were not sufficiently cast in biological terms to warrant being classified as racial. Once again, it would be useful to analyze this claim along empirical and theoretical lines. Empirically speaking, discourses of race throughout the early Republican period, in fact, made abundant references to crudely biological lines of reasoning. I devote a significant portion of this book to documenting the extent and nature of biologically informed scholarship that liberally sprinkled race related writings with the language of blood, skulls, and bones. From a theoretical point of view, we need to think about the difficulty of delineating clear-cut boundaries across different ways of building solidarities and exclusions such as race, ethnicity, and nation. The argument that race in Turkey was not biological devises a division of labor between race and ethnicity or race and nation, with the accompanying implication that the former is harmful, whereas the latter is acceptable. Replicating the ethnic civic dichotomy originally formulated by Hans Kahn to distinguish Eastern and Western nationalism. However, racial definitions never entirely operate along biological or social factors alone because social construction have to rely on a selective repertoire of physically identifiable features, whereas putatively visible differences make sense only within a socially meaningful universe. Defining race as a group of human beings socially defined on the basis of physical characteristics shows the interplay between biology and culture. Racial categories and their overlaps with ethnicity and nation transcend a simple division of labor between biology and culture. Debates on new racisms draw attention to the declining role of biological hierarchies as ways to establish racial difference in contemporary period or in the contemporary period. The driving force in the new racisms is not biological heredity, but the insurmountability of cultural differences. The power of racial vocabularies originates from their ability to camouflage and deny their own existence. In the Turkish case, too, the post World War II period witnessed the virtual disappearance of racial vocabularies from the public idiom. Given the immense capacity of racial discourses for self transformation and self denial, searching for biology in the fuzzy contemporary cultural nexus of racial vocabularies would be a futile exercise. This book insists this book insists that the significance of race in the formation and maintenance of Turkish identity persists despite the changes in the way racial discourses operate because biological and cultural ways of building solidarity and difference significantly overlap. Race matters because it routinely crosses the boundaries between biology, culture, nation, or ethnicity, but still maintains conceptual integrity. This complex picture will be suggested when I focus on the construction of Turkishness as an immutable category, the chromatic emphasis on physical features, and the links between race and modernity connected to a nexus of inferiority and superiority around insurmountable cultural boundaries. Very interesting. Very interesting. Let's continue here. The West had it too. Oh God, I would love to read this. Oh, why are you only focusing on racism in Turkey? Don't you know the West did it too? Anyway, all right. A professor whose opinion I sought when collecting data for this book quit. In the same period, there was no race science in Europe, too. Sorry. You know, in the same period, there was race science in Europe, too. So, who cares? Why do white people say this? Maybe Turkish people are white. Turkish people are white because, at the very least, they say the whitest things. Uh, you know, uh, 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 Other white people did it, too, or it wasn't that bad. Uh, well, stop focusing on race or stop making the nation look bad. You only focus on the negative. All the stuff white people generally say when you talk about race, Turkish people say it too. So yeah, Turks are white. Case closed. Live stream done. I'm gonna go get a burger. Anyway, you know, in the same period, there was race science in Europe too, said a professor, suggesting to me that pursuing this study in Turkey will be useless because even the Europeans were not free from the virulence of racial discourses before World War II. Race in Turkey is said to be insignificant then, not only because it is internally aberrational, but externally too typical. Although this view may sound odd, it is important to analyze some of its assumptions, because the West had it too comes up rather frequently as a defense mechanism in Turkey's vexed interactions with Europe. This defensive strategy has a twisted anti intellectual assumption behind it because it transforms any attempt to study and understand a controversial aspect of Turkey's past into an attack. In other words, rather than the study of race in Turkey constituting an offensive that creates the need for a defense, the defense itself manufactures a putative attack where none exist. Therefore, the West had it too, maintains close relations with don't make your own look bad argument and endeavors to turn academic study into a guilt trip by morally justifying and empirically trivializing racial discourses in Turkish history. Behind the defensive, proud stance, however, lies a deep rooted Orientalist gaze directed on oneself that projects a one way direction for historical change. From the West to the East, the idea that Europe makes history and the rest follows suit is naturalized in this way of thinking. In addition, the sense of relief emanated with the claim that Turkey is only replicating the quote unquote mistakes of the West results in a mechanized and unilinear sense of history. Throughout this book, I intend to show the complex interactions between global racial discourses and their local manifestations, rather than succumbing to a simplistic view in which Turkey merely imitates European race science. It is true the West had it too, but the Turkish case deserves as much academic interest as race and racial discourses have received in the Western context. This is necessary in order to examine the global reach of race in particular settings and the transnational linkages between Turkey and Europe. Continuing here. So, race was only meant to build self confidence. Okay, 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 strange. When confronted with the empirical reality of racial discourse in early Republican Turkey, a familiar defense mechanism is to emphasize the necessity of race along the lines of giving the war weary Turkish nation self confidence for modernization. The modernizing elite, as the story goes, purposefully relied on exaggerated and now outlandish racial claims just to inject a strong dose of superiority and self confidence into the dejected Anatolian population. A number of problematic assumptions are easy to detect in this argument. First of all, there is the worn out ours is good, theirs is bad assumption, according to which two types of racial discourses exist: the bad, with which one kills and exploits, and the good, with which one instills confidence. While it makes sense to entertain the defensive uses of the race idea as an analytical tool, this does not establish the defensive racial discourses are insignificant, historically necessary, or benign. Moreover, the quote unquote self confidence argument draws a distorted picture of history in which an all powerful bloc of elites manipulates passive masses. Even if part of the elite has considered racial mobilization as a tool for raising national confidence, this again does not eliminate the need to study the rise and consequences of such an effort. Finally, the self confidence defense implies that racial discourses emerged out of nowhere in the 1930s when they were necessary and magically disappeared after World War II when the need for them disappeared. As I will show at the end of this book, the race idea is a sticky one that tends to linger even after the term quote unquote race recedes. Why care about the Turkish case? Why do you care, nigga? Why are you talking about race? Stop it. Stop it. Stop talking about race. Anyway, many scholars based in Turkey or in other parts of the non Western world, for that matter, go through the same ritual in European and North American conferences and publications when they try to convince the audience of the significance of their case. Part of the process has to do with providing historical backgrounds on quote unquote exotic cases in which Western audiences may not be familiar, although these backgrounds eat up precious time in conference presentations and precious space in publications. The other part involves establishing the relevance of a particular case to a theoretical issue that is almost always produced regarding in the context of or from the perspective of the European and North American settings. The result is a crude academic division of labor. Research in and for the West gives us academically generalizable findings, or theory, if you will, whereas cases in the rest of the world enrich this theory or offer counterexamples to be noted. At best, in an ordinary journal article, for example, race theory in the United States is race theory, period. But in the same journal, race theory in Brazil has to be clearly specified as such. This is all the more interesting given the fact that the United States can be considered an exceptional case in many ways. Absolutely. It is true that a non specialist should be introduced to the particularities of the Turkish case, which I duly provide in this book, and that international hierarchies or of information render the West more readily known globally. Yet beyond the innocent face of historical backgrounds lurks two significant issues that I will discuss here. The first involves the practice of rendering European and North American contexts as cases that can be generalizable into broad theories, relegating the rest into decorative cases outside of general theoretical frameworks, or rendering them important as long as they as long as their relevance for Europe or North America, as long as they as long as they are relevant for Europe or North America. There's quite a few typos in this book, and I find this interesting for such a scholarly work. I don't know. Should have had an editor. I'm going to reread that sentence. The first involves the practice of rendering European and North American context as cases that can be generalizable into broad theories, relegating the rest into decorative cases outside of general theoretical frameworks, or rendering them important long as they as long as their relevance for Europe or America. That's so hard to comprehend right there because of the typo. Anyway, the second involves defining cases predominantly along national borders. All right, so the West equals theory, the rest equals mere case. So the first issue has to do with the way international academic hierarchies relegate the non-Western experience to the status of exotic cases, interesting anecdotes to enrich a theory without causing significant shifts in established theoretical thinking. Especially when examining subject matters such as race and nationalism, however, scholars have to pay attention both to local manifestations and to global commonalities and linkages. My rejection of the argument that race is a foreign concept for Turkey must have illustrated that I am not only critical of European or American exceptionalism, but also of Turkish exceptionalism. While paying attention to the particularities of each setting, it is also necessary to link these particularities both empirically and theoretically. However, these linkages cannot take place on a one-way street from the West to the rest. Genuine exchange between particular cases should help challenge international scholarly hierarchies and produce knowledge that is both locally grounded and globally meaningful. Such a broad and difficult task cannot, of course, be accomplished in a single work, but in this book at least, I intend to be vigilant in seeking connections between different locations and bodies of knowledge. One of these connections is theoretical and has to do with situating racial discourses in Turkey within a broad scholarship on race and whiteness. The historical transformation of racial conception in Turkey and their concealed but powerful presence has great potential for contributing to the global literature on race. A theoretical framework that places emphasis on transnational linkages can address an important question. To what extent is the term race conceptually persistent? In other words, do the myriad variations in the use of race across cases make the concept empty and obsolete? Only a body of scholarship that pays heed to linked particularities and that challenges the theoretical exceptionalism of the West can accomplish such a daunting task. I would argue that yes, the term race still has meaning today, and the word has not been bastardized. And you'll know race does exist when you're in a country like Armenia or Azerbaijan, or you're traveling around Southern Europe and you get called the N word. Yes, they know race. Race does exist. Okay, if they have racial slurs that still permeate throughout our world, then yes, the term race is still pertinent. Right? If there are still different ways that people perceive groups of people based on their phenotypes, which is prevalent throughout the world, then yes, race is still a good concept to use. So I would argue that if he is going to make that argument, I would disagree with that wholeheartedly. Continuing here. The Turkish case, as well as other non-Western cases, does not merely provide the testimony of a bizarre and understudied issue, but also contributes to theoretical debates concerning the contextual variations of race. Having rejected Turkish exceptionalism, another connection is in order. This time, the emphasis is on the global circulation of racial discourses. While it is important to seek the contribution of the Turkish case into broad theoretical discussions, it is also important to examine the local manifestations of race in Turkey from a broad theoretical perspective. Critical race theory or whiteness studies may at first appear foreign in the Turkish context. However, these connections are essential in establishing the conceptual autonomy of race in the Turkish context. Although there are complex overlaps between race and related concepts such as nation and ethnicity, relying entirely on. Once again, there's so many prepositional typos. Jesus. Relying entirely on the literature of nationalism to study the Turkish case reduces racial vocabularies of Turkish modernization merely to the discourse of nation building. The first issue has another dimension: generalizability. Many scholars working on cases must have faced the dreaded question: how generalizable is your study at various points in their careers? Concern with generalization has been inscribed in sociology partly to distinguish the discipline from what is traditionally considered to be a particularist emphasis, stereotypically epitomized by history. Although the division of labor between history, paying attention to detail, and sociology, paying attention to generalities, has been thoroughly questioned, the issue of generalization has to be considered in the context of case studies. I am not looking forward to, when I become a sociologist one day, to doing those papers and that sort of research. That's probably what I fear the most. I love teaching. I love learning. I love learning about these topics in particular, but the work, right? Especially as a teacher, like the paperwork, I got a ton of paperwork I'm backed up on right now that I need to jump on, right? As soon as I finish this class. So yeah, it's probably even worse for the professors and the academics and the researchers, especially in sociology. Continuing here. Is generalization merely a matter of juxtaposing a collection of similarities and differences across cases that are stripped of their particularities? In other words, is generalization possible only through the analysis of a number of reductive marks on a questionnaire declaring female, middle class, or white? The monopoly of such a view of generalization has been seriously challenged by the rise of post-positivist research paradigms that emphasize marginality, specificity, and even uniqueness. However, it would be imprudent to rid of the idea of generalization hastily. The International Academic Division of Labor, as I discussed above, may relegate many non-Western countries to mere case studies, and in turn impose a sense of undue uniformity on what happens within national borders. Considering the complexity of cases and the problematic nature of the boundaries that separate them, we need to concede that cases are generalizations. Hostility toward the idea of generalization as a positivist tool misses the point that case studies, no matter how small their extent and how impenetrable their boundaries may appear, have to deal with the issue of generalizing an enormous complexity of social interactions and material relations present in a given setting into a case. Another type of reductionism operates here, automatically interpreting all concerns of generalizations as heresy to post-positivist epistemologies. The putative incommensurability of positivist and post-positivist epistemologies does not have to lead to a pernicious antinomy. There we go. If the concept of generalization can be ensconced in case studies, not in the sense of sorting out the similarities and weeding out differences, but in the sense of establishing linkages across time and space. Scholars working on cases do not need to defend a framework in which generalization becomes unnecessary and impossible for case studies. So just to simplify that paragraph, from my understanding, what he's saying is that, generalizing in this case when doing the study of race for particular times or spaces is okay to some degree. To some degree, generalizations are a great way of making these markers on understanding how people understood race then and now. All right, that's my understanding. Right? Social scientists can envision a more constructive approach than assigning mutually exclusive territories of methodological authority, positive science for the task of generalization, and case studies for the task of specific, deep, and context-based understanding. In order to accomplish a quantum leap of conversion and conversation, the monopoly by positive science on issues of generalizations should be challenged. In other words, the question social scientists should ponder is not whether generalization remains a necessary goal in the social sciences in general, but rather how to formulate a broader sense of generalization that is not imprisoned within the confines of positive science. Considered this way, generalization is so intricately embedded in the idea of a case that instead of being disregarded as unnecessary or impossible, it should be regarded as an integral part of case studies. The idea of generalization in positive science begins by constructing a collection. a collection of similar cases, such as individuals, organizations, and nation states that are considered as unproblematically bounded entities. These entities putatively contain certain attributes that can be measured more or less precisely. Explanations are built upon examining these units based on a framework of similarities and differences. Simply put, generalization takes place by making summary statements about a number of comparably similar yet distinguishable different entities. When they succumb to the notion of cases as geographically and temporally bounded entities, researchers subscribing to the case methodology understandably become defensive about generalization. While a deeper understanding of a specific case is a valuable goal in itself, that is not the only justification for a case study approach. A generalizable case starts with questioning the role of boundaries as the defining characteristics of cases, both theoretically and methodologically. Considered as a comparatively well defined entity with a clear cut and arbitrary geographical and temporal boundaries, a case is easy to dismiss as just one example among many. Consequently, case studies seem as if they focus on just one of few cases, while positive science studies many. The only advantage of case studies in this view is that case studies yield richer data. So basically, he's saying, like, you might study one individual case so thoroughly and in depth, and that's where you derive your research. But generalizations look at many cases over many periods of time or spaces and can yield greater results, right? Not saying that cases are not necessary to do study on a topic, but generalization should not also be discounted as well. So, as I have argued, another way to approach this problematic would be to characterize cases as general entities to begin with. From this standpoint, a case does not necessarily have to be an entity encircled with natural boundaries. Boundaries enter the picture as contingent analytical tools that make it easy to understand such concepts as exchange, movement, or motion. Thus, case studies do not have to do with studying only one particular example among many similar cases. This is not to argue that case studies should include more than one case for comparative reasons, hence mimicking positive science in order to reach a level of generalization. On the contrary, what defines a case is rather the spatial and temporal position of researchers from which they analyze social phenomena. A case is, in fact, a location situated within a process rather than a bounded entity. What delimits the boundaries of a case is a researcher's ability to extend temporally and spatially from given specific locations. Any question of generalization in a case study is incomplete unless we ask generalization in which direction. Extensions in case studies could occur in multitude of directions. They could occur in a multitude of directions, not only because accumulated knowledge of already existing theories directs initial research questions and guides the interpretation of findings, but also because of the contingent nature of cases that actually helps us reconsider the definition of a case and allows researchers to transcend boundaries in search of exchange and movement. Analyzing power emerges as a significant promise for this type of case study. Deciphering a set of power relations within an extended temporal and spatial context allows the social scientist to make sense of a generalized process of reproduction and resistance, since power regimes tend to disregard the conceptual demarcation lines between micro and macro. Once again, just saying that generalizations have a purpose. They have a place in the study of a topic in the social sciences. Continuing. Cases, when regarded, okay, he's really got a beef with cases. He keeps on going off on case studies. Continuing, cases, when regarded as a single example among many other comparable entities, require the researchers to have a timeless and placeless view to establish relations of similarity and differences across distinct entities. However, these cases already encompass a multitude of empirical interconnections in many ways. Although case exists Although cases exist in specific histories as concrete units, they are also aligned with analytical and theoretical categories. When we consider cases as generalizable entities composed of a set of complicated social relations, the corollary is that a researcher occupies one or multiple locations within the entity, looking around, as it were, and trying to see as far as possible. Turkey, in my research, is not merely a case to be compared with other nation states. It is rather a combination of individual actors, local and foreign scholars, organizations, universities, and government entities, social relations, interactions between local and foreign scholars, discourses, racial, nationalist, linguistic, historical, and practices, higher education curricula, and legal regulations. Talking about quote unquote Turkey is by definition making a generalization. Cases compared with circumstances, instances, or events involve the study of a particular social setting with some sense of generality. Conceptualized in this way, case studies offer insights into the structure agency debate in the social sciences. How do societies change and how do they remain stable? What is the role of individual and collective agency in social change? These questions should be treated not as a theoretical problem, which presents the difficult and unnecessary issue of finding the right balance between structure and agency for all historical cases as a theoretical principle, but as an historical or empirical problem. The question to ask is, how do structure and agency interact in this case? This is not to reject any attempt to explore and employ theoretical debates that outline the configuration of structure and action. Clearly, certain patterns and contingencies can be transmitted across time and space, across the boundaries of cases that are fluid to begin with. The level of abstraction that can be reached by theoretical outlines of the problem of structuring should not interfere with efforts to examine social life in a context of cases. Configurations of structure and action vary historically, and the distribution of power in societies cannot be conceived as a static force either. A static view of power, which excludes the possibility of historical variation in the way in the way actors enable and alter each other's actions, under theorizes agency, thus structuring work temporally in such a way that the theoretical balance between structure and agency emerges out of historical contingencies that make sense only when we understand the way power operates in a particular context. Therefore, a historically informed social science can illuminate the structure agency problem by insisting on a tight cooperation between theoretical and empirical models, since conflict and power are not logically but contingently associated. I'll be honest with you, a lot of that flew over my head because I am just now beginning to study sociology. Haven't even begun my first semester, but I'm very interested in this. But the general overall idea, the generalization for this is that he thinks generalization is okay because talking about race in Turkey is already broad enough. And so, yeah, generalization is important when trying to come to some conclusion or trying to do any study, right? Continuing here. All right, we're almost finished with chapter one. So, cases and national boundaries. This takes us to the second issue that has to do with defining cases and writing historical backgrounds. All too frequently, cases are reduced to a focus on nation states. In a world with border checks, passports, visas, and the Olympic Games, it is difficult to deny the relevance of national boundaries for social inquiry and their power to define the individual and collective identities. While acknowledging the power of national boundaries as a social construction, the social sciences should also be able to emphasize what goes through these boundaries. Taking national boundaries for granted and forgetting that despite their very real institutional consequences, they are, in the final analysis, artificial creations with a porous nature, would entail internalizing nationalist discourses, which is equivalent to methodological nationalism. The researcher's specific location in a case study produces a unique yet comparable configuration of generalizable knowledge, since a case is a collection of things and linkages connecting these things. How far one looks, sees, and extends will depend on the sources available to the researcher and the theoretical concerns of the study. The limits of cases, however, need not be national boundaries. National boundaries always allow connections and interactions to occur. Studying the movement of things across national borders can help social scientists overcome the tendency automatically to associate nation-state boundaries with national boundaries for cases. The constant movement of ideas, as well as the physical movement of people, together with the interactions between Turkey and the larger Western discourses of race and nationalism, in fact, make it impossible to classify this project as a case study in the traditional sense. On the contrary, one of my main goals is to provide evidence for the claim that Turkish racial and national identities came into being as a result of very active relationships between Turkish and Western intellectuals. Turkishness was not made entirely in Turkey, nor was it made entirely for Turks. What makes this project truly larger than the case of Turkey is the insistence on what Arjun Appandurai calls the thing in motion. Only by following the trajectory of things, persons, ideas, or discourses, for example, can we understand the social context and the complexity of relations within which they are embedded. Studying the formation of Turkishness does not require one to focus solely on Turkey. While having a specific spatial and temporal position in Turkey, I will be attempting to extend my analysis beyond nation state boundaries by following the interactions between scholars across borders. Instead of seeing individuals, organizations, nations, and other categories as carriers of certain traits, which, as I mentioned, in the basis of positive science, the type of research I have employed focuses on how theoretical concepts, nationalism, race, etc., unfold in practical ways. Here, through the interactions of Western intellectuals and Turkish scholars, the entities that positive science investigates are compared on the basis of similarities and differences. Their claim to generalization are built around the notion of representativeness. My goal, instead, is to reach a level of generality through connections that go beyond the political boundaries of nation states. In this model, generalization occurs by combining a number of cases, not only at one level, for example, a collection of individuals, but also at multiple levels that are embedded in one another, such as the individual and the nation state. Observing individuals and collectivities engaged in action and interaction forms the basis of this approach. Studying this web of interactions between different types of entities rather than an unorderly relationship between similar and different types can help social scientists reach a different level of generality that builds not only on the fact that a case already represents a claim to generalization, but also on the fact that cases are also interconnected, that boundaries between them could be transcended by careful theoretical and empirical work. So that's the end of chapter 1 and the introduction. So in our next live stream, we're going to be looking at chapter 2, the Republican conversion narrative. And let's see how long this is. Going to be looking at chapter 2. Chapter 2, and I think tomorrow we can also cover chapter 3, Encounters with the West, Becoming White. All right, I think we could tackle both chapters for our next live stream tomorrow of this book. Might be a bit long because I think it's coming up close, like 40 pages, right? All right, maybe not all of chapter 3. Maybe not all of chapter 3 tomorrow because chapter 3 is actually quite in depth. Chapter 3 might have to be a live stream in and of itself because it's so deep and in detail. Yeah, chapter 3 is a beast. Chapter 3 is definitely a beast. It just keeps going on and on and on and on, don't it? Let me go up to the table of contents up here in the book. Let's see if we can look at it. All right, so we have chapter 1. Chapter 2 goes to page 29 to 48, so about 11 pages. Yeah, and chapter 3 goes up to 48 to 99. Okay, so yeah, we'll pick up in chapter 2 and probably tackle half of 30. Yeah, yeah. We'll probably go from 30 to 78. So we'll start the Republican conversion narrative, read all of that, and go up all the way to Becoming White, the Ghosts of the Past, Ottoman Modernization and Encounters with the West, the Ottoman Interest in Race, European Orientalists, and the Turkic intellectuals. And that's what we'll cover in our next reading of Is the Turk a White Man? The book by Murat Ergin, published in 2018. Shout out to everybody who jumped into the chat. Shout out to everybody who tuned in for this live stream. Shout out to my beautiful wife, Act Dennis. Shout out to Sasha Khan. Shout out to Av Cree. And shout out to Brian G as well. Y'all stay tuned. Follow me on my channel. Subscribe, like, comment, share, all that good stuff. Be easy out there, and peace.